Hi there, welcome back. This is Daniel Kirsch, and here today to talk to you about the bureaucracy. I want to give you some additional background today to make sure that you can appreciate just who the bureaucracy is and the difference between what the president has directly to do with the bureaucracy and what kind of electoral politics really have to do with it. So a little bit of the history behind how presidents and political parties have been able to use the bureaucracy to their advantage and to reward their political supporters, and to what extent that's changed over time. It certainly has. So the first thing I want to do is go over a few numbers. So as all of you know, when we have a presidential election every year, the new president gets to appoint a certain number of people who are called political appointees. People they appoint from the Secretary of State to the Secretary of Defense to the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, and a lot of the people in between, to the Deputy Undersecretary for Operations in the Department of Agriculture, for example. So all of those positions that have to go through not only an appointment process by the President, but then also a confirmation process by the Senate. And there are roughly 1,200 of those positions that are Senate confirmable and that are appointed by the President every 4 years. So let's put a little circle around that. And including that, there are about 8,000 positions in total within the federal government that are purely political appointees that the president appoints every 4 years. But most of them are not subject to Senate confirmation. But then they're also not subject to what are called civil service protections, where they're an employee and whoever the president is doesn't matter. So in addition to those employees, there's also what we have that we include as our active duty military employees. We'll call them employees, but our active duty military officers and enlisted men and women. So there are essentially 1.3 million of those. So you've got your 8,000 appointees, your 1.3 million active duty military, and then so all these civilian and full-time employees in the federal government is something like 1.2 million. I'm sorry, 2.1 million. And so that's a lot of employees. We'll come back to those employees in just a second, but I want to emphasize that all of these are simply counted as a small fraction of the total workers in the United States. So that number is 155 million. So yes, the federal government is the largest employer, but there are also many large companies that many work for, many conglomerates. The federal government kind of edges out most of them. It's the #1 employer in the U.S., especially if you count active duty military, but even without that, it's the #1 employer in terms of the quantities of people. It's also a very good job to have the federal government signing your paycheck. They have great pension and benefits, really better than almost anything in the private sector. Maybe the salary isn't as good, but it has a certain amount of job security. And it's much like, if any of you know people who work directly for the California state government, for example, it's really very similar to that. It's called civil service protection. It means basically you have something like property rights to your job, meaning that if you're going to be fired, you're not an at-will employee, you're an employee with civil service protection, meaning if you're going to be terminated from your employment, your employer has to show cause. It has to show that you have demonstrated incompetence or some kind of malfeasance or moral turbidity. So that's another ball of wax. But in fact, a lot of K-12 school teachers and college and university professors have something similar protection called tenure. But federal government employees are people as diverse as people who work in the Department of Agriculture, to the rangers of the National Park Service, to physicians who work for all the branches, and nurses as well. You have interpreters of various languages, excuse me. You have civilian employees within the Department of Defense. You have, all the postal employees that mail carriers, as well as postal workers. Everyone whose paycheck comes directly from the U.S. Department of the Treasury as a federal employee. All those people are federal employees, and all of them have the ability to receive all the benefits that the federal government provides. Most, or at least a large chunk, also have the option of joining something called a labor union within the federal government. There's one called the AFGE, the American Federation of Government Employees. Now, actually, not all of government employees belong to this labor union. Many of them don't. but also some of them belong to other unions like the American Postal Workers Union, the National Association of Letter Carriers, and several other unions that I can't name, I have not researched. But with their membership as people who are employed by the federal government, by far the largest is the AFGE. I believe they have something in the neighborhood of 300,000 members. They have the pressure. They have been able to pressure the U.S. government into giving them these job protections, and these job protections work for anyone who works for, again, the Bureau of Justice Statistics. I've had a few friends work for that bureau, Bureau of Statistics and the Department of Labor. So all of those are places that have employees that are often lifetime employees. They stay in their jobs for 15 or 20 or 30 years, so they can get vested in the federal retirement system and pension system. They can have, a secure income well into their retirement, as well as really marquee health care. I think that's second only to maybe congressional health care. They're usually considered a very highly skilled workforce. To get a job in the federal government, you need a lot of qualifications, so not anyone can just sign up and get one. You need to pass criminal background checks, of course, but you also need to be highly skilled. They have hiring seasons for physicians, things like that, engineers, other highly skilled professionals too. So these types of positions are the kind operate pardon me. So I want to shift gears a little, and so in addition to that large workforce of at least 500,000 people, there are also about 500 people who work for the West Wing of the White House. They kind of work as advisors to the president, experts, and administrative assistants, if you will. So all of those kinds of jobs are not really the vast majority of federal government jobs. That's just it's a different, maybe highly romanticized version of working for the federal government, is working directly for the president. There are people who populate the National Drug Control Policy Board, the National Economic Council, all these places that are talked about in the executive branch lecture that are part of the Executive Office of the President. But throughout all of the cabinet, there are 8,000 of these positions that actually have to just be restaffed and rehired every 4 years. But these upper level management positions are the ones that are Senate confirmable, secretaries of all the departments, 15 of those, and their deputy secretaries, all the people who really direct policy from leadership positions, and those that are directed by the president and Congress. So they're the ones who create policy directions for all the employees in the federal government. So of these, so when I talk about political appointees, I talk mostly about government employees in history. I'm really talking about this circle of people. It has a really long history, and as far as the American political history can be called long. But initially, the federal government's employees were thought to be people who were, of course, highly educated, and they were only, in the Federalist government of George Washington and John Adams, and led in part by Alexander Hamilton, would only hire someone of really high education. These positions were highly skilled they were highly skilled in matters like war and financial and legal matters. But the federal government was a fraction of its former self. I'd be surprised if there were 8,000 employees total during the Washington and Adams administrations. That really started to change after those first 12 years. And then Jefferson came to power. He started to fill those positions with people who were his political allies. He fired all the Federalists because they were essentially at-will employees, served at the pleasure of the president, as we say these days. He replaced them with what we would call Jeffersonians, his allies. But then he did it in 1801. For over the next 27, 28 years, things kind of got back to normal. Federalists and former Federalists kind of crept back in. They returned to that ethos of only hiring the best and the brightest, no matter what their affiliation or beliefs. This was eventually called the era of good feelings. Everyone basically belonged to the same political party, and that party itself was thought to, have different wings. And parties were something from the past, but this was not really a permanent change. And one person who symbolically at least helped that along is that person who lent his name to an era, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a person who was elected at this time when a lot of the states were freeing up a lot of their voting procedures to the point where initially the people who voted were the people who were only men, who were all white, and there were a lot of restrictions on voting, and it made it so that only white male property owners could actually vote. So because of that difficulty in establishing any kind of widespread voting access, there was a lack of democracy. The thing is that when states like New York and Virginia began to abolish their property qualifications, that's, we should take that with a grain of salt. We got to universal white male suffrage, which was an improvement at the time, but not really still democracy. So meaning that all white males were now essentially eligible to vote, which in hindsight seems, very small and almost laughable in terms of terms that we know today of patriarchy, racial superiority, certainly economic discrimination. However, you know that for the time it at least doubled and tripled the number of people in many cases who were eligible to vote in those states. So there was somewhat of a class element where the wealthy landowners were not the only people now who were able to vote in elections and have not only their voices heard, but their interests represented in government. And so these people, like Andrew Jackson, really had to reach out to them to get their vote and change the conversation about politics because it brought new interests and new issues to the bargaining table. So when did this change government? And so when this did happen, it changed government. So, Jackson, he ushered in this era of what became known as the spoils system because he relied upon this old saying from politics and war in Western Europe in those countries that to the victor go the spoils. And so the spoils system was the system whereby the president could simply fire everyone who was in the federal government at the time and replace them. And it was a him. There were no women employed by the federal government at this time, to my knowledge. Replace them with his allies. And so the spoils system, starting in 1828 and 29, when Jackson was inaugurated as president, started this whole era of, whoever is president really just gets to staff the federal government, kind of capture the federal government, and it really solidified the division between the two political parties. So the Jackson Party became known as the Democratic Party. And before the Republicans were a generation later, the opposition party was known as the Whigs. They saw Jackson as a tyrant because a lot of their friends had been tossed out of government by him, and so they called him a tyrant. And so they took the name Whig from British parliamentary history, and that was opposed to the king's kind of one-person rule. But the Whigs, I'm not even going to write their name right now and get into the whole political party history. The Whigs grew into the Republicans, and when the Republicans had adopted this anti-slavery stance, which, by the way, was an important thing to mention about the Jackson Party, just because the Democratic Party was called the Democratic Party, doesn't mean it's the same kind of Democratic Party it is today. Just because there were more white males that were allowed to be in the party. Primarily the Democratic Party during this era, during the kind of post-Civil War era, was really more so it was less like they're a Democratic Party today and more like its own kind of segregationist and certainly pro-slavery party before the Civil War. Jackson certainly had a lot of plantation owners and slave owners who were his constituents and party members, and he was one himself. What's important to realize during this era is the federal government was growing a kind of growing, shifting, amorphous thing, and the states were still seen as more or less on equal footing with the federal government. Of course, this mentality led to the Civil War, 1861 to 65. So, Lincoln won in those years, and then eventually the next election after the Civil War, Grant. He ran for president after the Civil War. He won 2 elections. And so during that 16-year period, Republicans really grew to depend on the federal government as a rewards or spoils system for their supporters. And so in 1876, when it looked like the Democrats probably won legitimately, the Republicans kind of made a deal with the Democrats and said, look, we know you might have won this election, but if you award us these electors, we can pull our troops out of the South permanently, and you can go back to running the South the way you see fit, bringing back slavery in all but name, essentially. So that was the deal. And so that was what was done. And so over this, we'll go over this in some of the other chapters. But what it did is remove the federal election monitors from the South and allowed what became known as the Jim Crow laws, the segregation laws that prevented actually in most cases, black people from voting in the South until the Civil Rights Movement almost a century later. So anyway, that's a side note, unfortunately. 1876 and then 1880 again, Rutherford B. Hayes is not a popular president. So he was elected but not renominated or chosen by the Republicans to run again. That fell to James Garfield, also of Ohio. But he was a member of Congress. He was a leader in Congress, but just a member, and he had been elected to the Senate in Ohio, but hadn't taken office yet. He was one of the biggest states at the time, still is today. But all of these presidents, Grant, Hayes, and Garfield, were all from Ohio. And there are more Ohio presidents to come. It's a really important state to win. Let's see. So Garfield had been elected to the Senate and had stayed by all accounts and really as a brilliant person. He was a college professor by age 21, whereas today the bare minimum to be one is probably still around 28 or 29, and the average age is like 34. So he went to all these top schools in the country. He was certainly anti-slavery. He had been a major in the Civil War. He was very well qualified. He was really also against the spoils system, but he was not somebody who really enjoyed that part of politics. He's more of an intellectual. There had been an effort by Grant to recapture the nomination in 1880. Grant was still alive at this time, and I believe by this point he was bankrupt, and later on he had to write his memoirs while he was dying of cancer to be able to save his family's position, to provide for his family after his death. He wrote his memoirs. That was before the days of presidential pensions. He wrote his memoirs, considered some of the most well-written memoirs in American kind of biographical history. But at this point, he thought the best route to financial well-being would be to once again run for president and win again. So at the time, the spoils system functioned for Republicans in a way that was really a reward for really wealthy industrialists. The Union Pacific Railroad really had bought and sold the Grant administration. So he had a really scandal-ridden administration between 1869 and 77, and it proved too much of a barrier to his renomination in 1880. But the pro-Grant faction, wealthy Northern industrialists, ended up nominating Chester Arthur of New York, whose job it was to dispense patronage or federal government jobs to Republican allies at the Port of New York, which is where most taxes were collected before the days of income taxes. So James Garfield, brilliant scholar, leader in Congress, nominated by Republicans, won, but he was shot by a disaffected job seeker in Washington in 1881 in July. It was not a fatal wound, but the swampy air and lack of antibiotics and unsanitary medical practices led to his death from those injuries in September of that year. Chester Arthur became president, ironically, as the chief dispenser of political jobs, the Collector Report of New York, signed the Pendleton Act, instituting the civil service system in 1883 as a result of the national outrage of a job seeker who could be motivated to kill the president. Later, presidents like Franklin Roosevelt, who was the first president elected with significant labor union support in 1932, began to once more use the federal government jobs as a reward for his political supporters. Things progressed until the PATCO strike in 1981, where Reagan, after his assassination attempt and his recovery, fired the striking air traffic controllers as a signal the federal government was no longer going to be a willing partner in labor and management collective bargaining employment arrangements. And the Trump administration recently unilaterally reduced the percentage of time federal employees could devote to union work as part of their employment. In other words, if you're elected as an officer in the union and your job is to function as an elected leader by your fellow members, you're not allowed to spend very much of your time doing that work, so the people who have elected you are prevented from having effective representation. So that's really the story of bureaucracy and federal employment. In many ways, it's shortchanging many aspects of it, but I hope it gives you a broad overview. and please bring your questions to class. Thank you for watching.